Welcome to the graveyard. Dang, sick. Howdy. There we go. Pretty beat. Alright, here's the piece we need. This is the pinion. Goes right down here. Just pulled it straight out. Let the steering rack loose. Cut a couple lines because nobody's gonna want to use it anyway. That's pretty simple to get to. I just had to pull the manifold out of the way because since it was pretty much off already. And yeah, that's all you need.
One pair of pants later.
Hey guys, welcome back. Thanks for sticking with me. I know it's been a while since my last video. There's been a lot of stuff going on. We're gonna be doing something that I've been wanting to do for a long time, ever since I had my first EK, probably like 10 years ago, and it was actually the same as this one. It was a black coupe, but it didn't have a B series, unfortunately, but this one's making up for that. If you have an EK, or if you've watched my previous videos, you know that the steering response on this car is horrible. It takes a lot of steering input in order to get the car to point where you want it to go, which is really cumbersome on track. It's like you're wrestling the car the whole time, shuffling your hands, going hand over hand. So today what we're doing is actually we're taking some information that was buried deep in the catacombs of Honda Tech forums, and we're gonna build a quick ratio steering rack for less than $100 using only Honda parts. One thing I will say is the benefit to this is that you don't have to remove the whole steering rack in order to get it done. You can do it with everything in the car. It is kind of tight, it is kind of tricky, so you gotta have some patience, because if you bend any of the power steering lines, they're gonna be kind of hard to work with when you're putting everything back together. So don't do that, because I did that and it's gonna be a pain in the ass. Long story short, we're gonna be getting this done. So the goal of this video is to reduce the steering ratio, which results in a faster steering response as well as a shorter lock to lock. So, you know, like less turns from full left to full right. So just to show you how it looks in factory form on the EK with power steering, we're looking at what they say it's 3.6 lock to lock. So we're gonna go from full right to full left, but we'll start this way. So going all the way around to the right. That's about 1.8 turns, full right. And then we'll go the opposite way. And that's 3.6 total lock to lock. Some of you may recognize the new steering wheel. I do have a quick release on here that is pretty, I think, cool, but I'll cover that in another video. All right, so that gear coming up out of the firewall there is gonna be our pinion. That's gonna be going into the steering rack, and we're gonna pull that out and replace it with the Integra. This one here, which is coming into focus, that's gonna be coming off of the steering column. That one goes straight to the steering wheel, and it's held together with this guy. It slides right in between the two gears, locks them together, and twists and spins. If you're going for a manual rack, which we'll talk about later, then you will need to get this piece from the Integra because it is different. I can get focused. There we go. So if you see, this bolt needs to come out. There's another one on this side behind it. And then you need to take these two guys out. And then on the back side, I'll show you from underneath the car, there's two lines that need to come out underneath there. There's a rubber line back behind here, behind these two metals that has a clamp on it that's hard to get to. You can actually kind of see the bolt, see it there. A little spring clamp is actually a 10 mil head, so it's pretty easy to get to, it looks like. Just put like a ratcheting wrench right there, and ratchet that bitch off. Okay, so we're under the car now. This is our steering rack right here, and these two lines, this one here, hard to see. The rubber one with the clamp on it, you can see from here, but you can't get to it from down here. So you're gonna have to get that from the top and then wiggle the clamp off and probably come in here with like a hose tool to kind of break the seal and wiggle it off. The bottom one here is a 14 mil. So just unscrew that with a 14 millimeter and you're good to go. It's definitely gonna leak, so be sure to get a pan and watch your face. So you can see I got both of these guys undone. Don't do what I did. Try not to bend the line, because if you bend these lines, they're gonna be really tricky to get back in place, most definitely. So I'll be struggling with that later. But I did want to show you that this method, if I can get my arm out of the way. So you got a wrench down there on the top of that spring bolt. So that is working perfectly. It's a ratcheting wrench. Just a quick couple, turns, and we're loose. So I can unscrew that with my finger, and then hopefully get underneath the car and pop that line off. So now we are ready to take these bolts off. I'm using this long boy with a swivel down there to get this guy, and then I'm gonna get the one at the back, probably using a wrench. All right, so I got my little ratchet down there. That's perfect for getting it off. If you got a little guy, be sure to use that. You wanna break it loose with a regular 12 millimeter. I use the box end. The angle really helps. So you go like this and you're good to go. But the true savior is this little guy. This little guy is perfect.
He's just a little guy. Come on.
We got all of our bolts out. And as you can see, I even got the lines out of the way. So what I actually did, I reached down and just twisted the whole thing. As you can see, that's why this bolt is not lined up anymore, because I literally twisted it clockwise. And what I did is it twisted enough to pop the lines all the way out, which kept me from really deforming them, which is good. So keep that in mind, give it a twist until the lines pop out, and that should free everything else as well and kind of break the seal. All right, so I got our pry bar. Poporino, just like that. And it's out. Boom. So we're back under the car. I'm gonna have to drop the rack down a little bit to make some space to pull the pinion right here all the way out. But to do that, it's really simple. I'm gonna take out these two bolts here. We're gonna take out this bolt. We're gonna unscrew this one, and then we're gonna move to the other side. I'm gonna take out this guy, that guy, right there. And then we're gonna loosen this one and this one. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna give us a little bit of room to kind of pivot the rack down. And then we can lower this side a bit and pop that pinion all the way out pretty easily. All right, so I got the rack dropped all the way down. I unbolted the rack, just let it drop, and then I gave it a little bit of twist to kind of shift the pinion a little bit towards the front. Now all I gotta do is reach down, pop it out, and then when I pop it out, I'm gonna pull it towards the passenger side. So the top will come and point towards the passenger side, and that will allow it to clear the firewall right here. The pinion is free from the firewall here. With this guy free already, I was able to tilt it towards the passenger side. So you move the tip towards the passenger side, and that should give you enough room to pull it out of the hole here. And then you can just wiggle it up, and you can get it out. Just like this. Just like that, and it's free. There we go. We're about halfway done already. I've got all the parts out, and they're gonna be over here on the bench. So let's go ahead and take a look at those parts, and then I'll explain what makes them different and why it's such an easy upgrade. All right, so what we have here is two power steering gearboxes. This one is out of my Civic, this one's out of a 2000 Integra. As you can see, they're pretty different, in regards to how the lines are run. This one has the feed lines on the right, this one has them straight out. The return is here and here, and the feed is here and here. And even though they look very different, they are effectively the same thing. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be swapping the pinion out of this one into this one. And the reason for that is because the Integra rack and the Civic rack are the same internally. They have the same tooth count on the rack itself. And the only real difference that gives the Integra the better ratio is the pinion. Now, the pinion is the internal shaft here. This is the pinion gear. These are the teeth. And the difference between the Civic and the Integra is that the Integra has 9 teeth, which is one more than the Civic with its 8 teeth, right? So it's gonna give us a little bit more than a half turn reduction in lock to lock, which is gonna be a massive help in the long run, especially when we're running on the track. It should reduce all the issues that we talked about before. So on that note, what we're gonna do is we're gonna actually pop this piece out and this piece, and we're gonna swap them around. Make sure to hold on to this because you're gonna wanna keep this on your Civic when you install it, because this is basically the dust boot. It keeps all the noise and the dirt out of your car. Otherwise it's gonna flow right up into your face. All right, so we got our boot. Now what we're gonna do, grab my handy dandy little hammer and just give it, boom, just like that. This is our pinion out of our Civic rack. As you can see, it's got all of our little orifices in there, and this is where the power steering fluid goes in and makes it work. And it has a little bearing at the end with a little washer behind it. It's got a circlip on this side. I'm gonna do the same with this guy over here. Also, this O-ring, I'll put the part number in the description. Make sure you get a new one when you do this. This one came apart a little easier because I already had it apart earlier. So there we go. So we're going to check to see if these washers make a difference in the depth of the pinion, and I'm pretty sure it will, so we're probably going to have to swap these around, but we'll see what the exact difference is right now. So this is the original Honda Civic. Okay, it's pretty good there. Alright, so it looks like we got about roughly 5 millimeters on this one, is how far down the bearing comes from the face of the pinion housing. Alright, now we'll check the Integra with the thick Integra washer on there. I don't know if you can kind of see it right here, that thicker washer. So about 0.6 millimeters, a little more than a half millimeter, this bearing comes out. So that means that it's probably gonna hit inside the steering rack, because that depth is different from the Integra to the Civic. So this is definitely gonna create some interference, and when you try to tighten this down, this is not gonna be seating properly against the rack. Ask me how I know. And it's going to cause it to stick up, and then you're going to try to tighten it down, and you're going to risk cracking and breaking the housing. So you want to make sure that the depth is right. Otherwise, that's going to create a wealth of issues. We're going to go ahead and swap this around. I'm going to disassemble these two, and then take this washer, this thinner washer here, off of the original Civic, and then we're going to put it on this one. On this end, you'll see that there's a circlip right here. And that circlip is what we got to take off, and then we have to slide this whole piece apart. Just working on taking it apart, and then we got the seal here. I just want to make sure that when I do put it back together, this is nice and dry, so it creates a good seal in there. So you want to make sure to clean everything out of here, get it nice and clean. Use like a carb cleaner, brake cleaner, whatever you want. Just get in there real good. Try to stay away from the bearing, but make sure this is all dry. Make sure this is dry before you reassemble. And then here we go. And then we got our washer, which is the most important part. Visually, you can tell that they're different thicknesses here, but I'm going to give them a measurement with a caliper and see what the exact size difference is. The Civic one comes in at 0.96, so just shy of a millimeter. And our Integra, 1.53. So like we said, 0.6 roughly, just a little over a half a millimeter difference in these two washers. We're gonna take the Civic washer and put it on the Integra pinion here. Slide it on over. We're gonna assemble the new Integra pinion using the washer from the Civic. We'll slap that on there real quick. So these two seals are pretty shot. They're old, they're pretty hard. Just to be safe, to make sure everything goes back together properly, I actually sourced a new seal. Unfortunately, I didn't get this from Honda. Honda does not really stock them anymore. It takes like a week to get them. So I just ordered it online from O'Reilly. It came in part of a rack and pinion rebuild kit. So slap that on there. Put this back together. Make sure you use the sleeve that came with the pinion that you're using. The pinion and the sleeve are machined to be a perfect fit together. So just make sure you line up this notch, this little nub here. Make sure you line that up with this notch here when you slide it on, just like this. Boom. Now we'll put our circlip back on. I didn't actually like how this circlip felt a little loose, so I'm going to use the circlip from the Civic. Now we're all reassembled. We have the Integra pinion with our washer, our seal, our valve body, our clip all back in place. We're going to throw some grease on here, some automotive grease. Make sure you put a ton on here, because if you don't, it's going to wear out pretty quick. It's going to, you know, eat away slowly at the gears if you don't have that lubrication there, because power steering fluid does not go here. That's what this seal is for. This seal prevents power steering fluid from leaking down into the rack itself, because there shouldn't be any power steering fluid here. Grease only. Make sure this is nice and clean and dry. Clean out your housing. Make sure that's nice and dry so that the seal gets a nice seat in there, because if it doesn't get a good seat, then it's not going to seal and it's going to leak. So clean it out. Carb cleaner, brake cleaner, whatever you want. Make sure it's nice and dry. Same thing with the seal itself. And then we'll be good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, get this assembled, and then we'll get it back in the car and we'll see if it works. Nice and sparkly clean. Look at that. Alright, let's drop this bad boy in. Just like a this. Boom. Another old Taparino. Sounds like it's seated all the way. Alright. Cool. So what we're going to do, I'm going to check the depth, see where we're at. See how close that brought us to the OE spec on the Civic. So 5 millimeters is what we're looking for. So that's perfect on that depth. That's pretty much it. You know, we'll pop on our little rubber boot. Just like so. On the rubber boot, we have this metal notch here. And that metal notch sticks out and goes into the rubber boot in 2 different positions depending on if you have right-hand drive or left-hand drive. So you'll notice there's an R and an L on the front of this thing. Since the car is left-hand drive, put it on the L. So if you put it on the R, like this, it's going to be angled incorrectly and it's not going to line up right with the car. So make sure that's just set to L, and then you're ready to basically drop this in after slapping some grease on here. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Then we'll get it in the car and see how it goes. One more thing to note real quick. The depth of this bearing is controlled by the washer that you saw earlier. And the importance of that is this guy here. This is a shim, a very thin shim. This guy goes in between the bearing and the power steering rack housing. The shim just goes, when it's in the rack, it'll sit against the bearing just like this. And that sets the depth of the pinion inside the rack. Now, realistically, because this is an Integra pinion, I'm sure that the measurements are going to be off, but our safest bet is to just reuse the washer inside from the Civic and use the Civic shim as well. So the shim sits down in the rack down there. You see how the rack is open? That's where the pinion goes. And there's a ridge, and this guy just goes like shoop, right down in there. I know this because mine fell out. I almost lost it. Don't lose it. Reuse it in conjunction with the washer from the Civic. Assemble it, and then you're good to go. All right, so you're gonna have some trouble getting this guy back in down here. And the easiest way to do it is to put it back in the same way you took it out, by getting it kind of in a little bit, tilting the tip towards the passenger side, and then you should be able to drop it into the power steering rack hole, and then lean it back over to fit inside the firewall. Now luckily, with the rack loose, it makes it a lot easier to move it and twist it back and forth. When you wiggle this back and forth, it'll allow you to position the pinion perfectly to get it in. It'll just kind of fall in on its own. It's going to be kind of tricky with the rack loose just because it will move when you're trying to move it around, but it's definitely going to be a big help if you get under here and you kind of twist it, back and forth while making adjustments at the top and then going back and forth to let it drop in. So mine is in, and I just got to kind of bolt everything back up, and then we'll get everything hooked up under the dash, and we'll test the lock to lock and see how that feels. All right, so when you're down here, make sure that everything is straight. Like, make sure the steering wheel's straight, make sure the wheels are straight. That way, when you slide this thing back on, your wheel's not crooked, tires aren't crooked, but you will have to have access to these bolts, which means you're going to have to turn the wheel off center to get to them. But pull the bolts out completely, then return the wheel to center. And once you return the wheel to center, then take it off. And that's the same position that you're going to want it in when you put it back on. One thing to note is where the bolts go in on these shafts, there are notches that line up. You can't see them because I put it back together, but there's notches in there, so you're going to want to make sure that those are lined up. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get this on. You're going to have a really hard time. Other than that, it's pretty straightforward. All right, so we're all done. I'm going to show you guys the before and after, which you saw earlier in the video, and we'll compare it to this with a new pinion installed, again, starting from center. So we'll go full right. It's 1.5. And a little over 1.5, maybe 1.6, if not a little under. And now this will be our 0, so we'll go back around. 1, 2, 3, right there. And then I'm just talking about the same spot and the opposite. So again, a little over 1.5. It actually might go a little bit further this way, but I would call that maybe 3.1, 3.2. So it's a decent difference from before, where it was about 3.6 total. So it's a huge reduction. So we're all good here. We'll move on and finish out the video. Alright, so I'm basically done with the car. I have a couple things to button up, but we're basically ready to go. As you saw, the lock to lock was reduced by about a half a turn, which is going to translate to a quicker steering ratio, something closer to that of the Integra, without all the work of having to swap the Integra rack over and the subframe and the control arms, because in order to achieve that same effect with that power steering rack, you do have to swap all those things over, and that's just a massive headache. This project is a little bit tricky. It is still kind of time consuming, and it does require a lot of patience, but as long as you maintain patience and focus, you'll get it done. And it's really worth it. I mean, I know it doesn't seem like it just from looking at the steering wheel spin, but when we get out there and drive it, and if you do it to your car and you feel it, you'll notice that it's going to be quite a big difference compared to what it was before. I did my best to cover as many aspects as I could during this install, because there is some information that is just kind of unknown with this project. There's a lot of research that I was doing, and there was some things that I ran into during the process that weren't mentioned anywhere, such as the shim and the steering rack. You don't want to lose that. You want to make sure that your pinion depth is based on that shim and the original washer that came in the housing on the car, because if those things don't match, you're going to end up having issues with clearances. You're going to possibly end up with too much space, like a little bit of a gap between the steering rack and the housing, and when you try to tighten that down, you can't force it. If you try to force it, you're going to snap the housing, and then you have to go buy a new housing, and that's double the work. Long story short, yeah, just make sure you have all the things that you need. Make sure you have the O-ring, make sure you have the seal, make sure you have all the tools necessary to do the job. As far as tips, I would say break all the lines loose, get them all disconnected before you pull the housing out, and then once you have all the lines disconnected, you can spin the housing clockwise, as I mentioned earlier, and that'll actually pull the pressure lines out of the housing without you having to force them and possibly risk bending them, because if you do that, getting it back together is even that much more of a nightmare, because if you've ever worked with hard lines before and these screw-in fittings, it is a pain in the ass if they're not lined up properly. And the same goes for the reverse. When you're putting it in, don't be afraid to twist it around and get those lines lined up, and then turn it counterclockwise and they'll pop right in there. And then before you tighten down the housing, make sure you get those fittings in, screwed in as much as you can. If you want to tighten them all the way before getting the housing bolted down, that's fine too, because it just makes it that much easier being able to shift the housing and maneuver those lines to get everything all screwed in. After that, you can drop the bolts in. You may have to manipulate the housing a little bit, maybe use a screwdriver, pry it one way or the other to make sure that everything is lined up, because if you did accidentally tweak the lines even the slightest bit, it is going to put some pressure on the housing and it's going to twist it, and when it's twisted, it's going to be that much harder to line up the bolts. So don't be afraid to pry on a little bit. Other than that, you know, just make sure you don't lose any components, make sure that you take your time, make sure that everything is good and tight. Don't be afraid to drop the steering rack down. It's not going to mess up your alignment. The only thing that's going to mess up your alignment is if you put the coupler on between the steering wheel and the pinion on the steering rack crooked, because then your steering wheel is going to be crooked, the wheels are going to be crooked, it's not going to match up. But make sure the steering wheel is straight, make sure the wheels are straight, get that coupler on, and then you're good as gold, and you should be the same if not better, because if your steering wheel was one way or another, this is your time to be able to correct that as well. One final note is that if you have an EK with a manual rack, in order to do this, you will have to swap to a power steering rack. You don't have to swap the whole power steering system over if you don't want to, but if you do want to, by all means, you know, I encourage it, especially because, you know, for me, I'm getting old, like, I like my power steering, I don't know. But for the manual rack, you will have to swap to the power steering rack. So when you do that, you'll also have to make sure that when you grab the Integra pinion, you grab the steering wheel coupler. The manual rack has different pinion teeth, so the coupler from your manual rack will not work. So make sure you get that coupler. Outside of that, everything is the same. If you have a manual rack and you want to swap to power steering and keep a manual rack, I recommend doing it the right way. Follow Michael Flair's video. He did a really great job on it. Covers pretty much A to Z on how to convert it. If not, feel free to reach out to Battlecraft. They're located out here in California. They will do the manual conversion for you, and they do really solid work, and plus they have a ton of other cool stuff that they could give your car. Shout out to those guys because they're always really cool. Other than that, I mean, I think that's pretty much everything. I think that we've covered A to Z as far as this install goes, and as you saw, it works really well, and I can't wait to get on the track and try it. I'm gonna button things up here a little bit more, get the car out of the garage, and then hopefully my next video will be able to talk about the performance of this upgrade, and you'll be able to see the difference on the next track day video that I post. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you learned something. I hope it inspired you to do this to your EK. We'll see you on the next one.